the Integration Station. I'm your host, Michael, a child and adolescent occupational therapist, and with me today is Eleanor.
I'm also a child and adolescent occupational therapist.
We have switched seats today.
We have. Seeing if we weren't sure if anyone was going to notice.
That was a dare from one of our other OTs.
Yeah,
who
we're so silly.
We are, for those.
But it does feel weird though, and I'm still getting used to it. But that's okay.
Look,
good to try different things.
Feel free to send in any dares or anything else you wanted. People that do have questions. We do have a Q&A format here, so we'll always take on questions or comments or otherwise. So
yeah, typically focus on how we can support the young people in our lives.
True.
But if it wants to be focused on dares for us, we can do that too.
We'll make sure we could add in a new segment on that. But yes, we as you said, we're trying to find the fun in learning how to support the young people in our lives. We can answer questions via Instagram, OTFC Group, otherwise podcast, otfcgroup.au is the other place you can reach us. And we had a few questions come in, which is great. We had one about a bike riding one. We had one to do with sensory tools and strategies for young kids going to school.
Yeah. I was hoping to circle back, I think, from some conversations that we had last week. I recognised there was an opportunity for us to maybe continue some conversations from there, but Excellent. I'll chat that all through when we get there.
And we'll get there after our regular
Yeah. What's the first one, Michael?
Therapy activity of the week.
I'll go first. I've got a great one.
Just ready to go. I can't wait to hear it.
I came prepared this week. So I was doing an activity with one of my young friends who trying to use the trapeze. So in the plus park we have at OTFC at Mile End, there's the spider wall. It's about 80 centimetres gap between one Perspex wall and another Perspex wall. And in between there, I had a bit of masking tape going from one side to the other, and he had to use the trapeze to sort of pull himself up and then get his feet to touch that masking tape. So pull himself up enough almost into a ball so his toes are touching the masking tape and then coming back down to the ground without breaking the tape.
Yeah, so good.
So a lot of strength, but also that really fine control, that really fine touch perception to be able to feel the tape and go, yep, I've touched it, but not push so hard that it breaks the tape.
Yeah, and so much body awareness too to know how you're moving in that little space and then how to exert, just enough force to, that's really cool.
Did it a few times. I gave it a go and it was really hard, really hard. So
yeah, good workout.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
There was a client that I was seeing once at Mile End that taught me how to do the spider wall. I took a really long time to learn how to do it. I don't know if it was a strength thing or a planning thing, but working out how to position my body so it's a hand on either side of the wall and a foot on either side to make it to the other end. That's hard.
If you can't do that effectively, then sometimes if your legs are long enough, you can put your back up against one side, straighten your legs out into an L shape.
Sure.
L shape and then shuffle yourself along. That's another way.
Yeah. No, I was very persistent and we would practice it together every week. And I think they were really motivated in teaching me how to do it. Like that brought them a sense of, I think, achievement and channeling their strengths, but be able to explain it to me and they would grade it for me too by if we can't do it like this, why don't you try it like that?
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, pretty cool. But my therapy activity of the week is actually one that I was doing with one of my teletherapy clients. And we had made a bit of a plan to make slime together, but not the one using the glue that probably is a bit more successful. I had found a couple of recipes using stuff that you have just at home, and we did one using shampoo and salt, which ended up being just very funny. We were both very surprised when initially bringing a tiny pinch of salt into a bowl of shampoo would make it solidify. But then if you add too much salt, it goes even runnier than it did before.
Right.
So it was very funny and very frustrating.
It's like a chemistry lesson.
Yeah, it is a little bit. And it just was really nice to, I think, share that experience together as well. And I guess thinking about therapy goals for her, we were looking at, I guess a lot of that life skill stuff, being able to have a recipe, follow it, collect the items that you need, problem solve when it wasn't working. But then there was a really strong sensory component too, which I think was quite regulating.
Yeah, and even just the attention and motivation to stay on the task.
Yeah.
Sometimes, you don't have everything or things don't quite work out. It's easy to go, forget it, I can't be bothered.
Yeah.
But obviously had captured enough enjoyment of the task
and
the motivation was there and wanted to keep going and see what happened.
I think there are definitely better ways to make slime, but it worked for all of our purposes and that's pretty cool.
Now you know. Great. We will now pass on to our next segment. Regulation strategy of the week.
Regulation, the strategy of the week.
I'll go first, Michael.
All right, you go first.
I have a good one this week. I was filming some stuff for our socials using my friend Rhodey, who is an inflatable horse that you can ride along.
Oh, Roddy. Sorry, yes. I was trying to think who
I know
you
we can bring that back up.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
I actually was corrected by one of my friends, and I used to always say Roddy, but now I have to say Rhodey.
Okay, that's fine.
So it's just best if I stay in this place. Otherwise, I don't need to probably get in that discussion again with her.
No, don't go there. That's fine. Thank you. Yeah, I know what you mean. Yes, continue. Little horsey thing.
Yeah, the little horsey thing. And one of the activities that we were doing were cage rolls, where essentially if you were doing it with a young person rather than an inflatable horse,
yes,
you would give them, lying down on the ground or on the bed, give them a great big bear hug and just roll from side to side. You can do as many rolls in a row as you can, or as far as you can go if you're doing it on the bed. I've actually been doing that with my little nephew recently when I was babysitting, and we would just before bed we would go and do some jumps and crashes, roll around, and actually I would roll him around and then throw him into a bunch of pillows, which he just loved.
Right.
I think like we've said before, you might think that can be more stimulating or excitatory before bed, but actually all the deep pressure, all of the movement input can be super organising and just help settle to sleep really well.
Yeah. Yeah, depends how long you do it for as well. Sometimes you reach that threshold and now it's very regulating.
Yes, absolutely.
Do it
and actually,
once
I think I feel like that might tie into one of the questions that we have coming up as well. I think it's like understanding what your young person needs to go, well, where's the point that we persist past to, yes, almost come down the other side if it has been more stimulating to start, to see that plateau out and then just really hit that regulation zone.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's a regulation strategy or more of like a sensory preference that can be quite regulating, and it's tassels.
Oh.
Do you like tassels?
I maybe depends on the context.
Yeah, that's a question without warning or without context. But I remember as a child, I always used to love curtains that I had the drawstring, and then at the end they have like a little tassel.
Yeah.
I love the feel of tassels. I can't remember where I was recently, but someone had tassels on something. I can't remember what it was exactly, but I just remember the feel of it, and I'm like, yes, I love the feel of tassels. And there's something, I don't know, some people I think absolutely hate it, but it's just this really soft, the multiple, fine threads just all together.
Like it's a good fidget,
But that's what I mean.
Yeah.
So I'm like, this could be actually a really excellent calming fidget because it's not alerting.
Yeah.
Well, sorry, I'll rephrase that. For some people, it might be alerting because they might not like the touch, but it's designed to be quite soft, and the texture is aimed to be quite smooth and calming. And yeah, I felt one the other day, and I was like, gosh, I forgot how good tassels are.
My sister actually has a leather tassel on her key ring, so I feel like something a little bit more subtle. You could have it on lanyard or holding a set of keys that you could just be sort of
depends. See, I think leather.
Okay, that's not going to fit
tassel
them.
Might be a bit too rough.
Okay, not meet your sensory preferences.
Yeah, but anyway, for me,
yeah, good thing that you can just easily access, carry around with you.
Absolutely. Yeah, just cut it off of someone's curtains. There you go.
Perfect. You're ready to go.
Wonderful.
In the pocket.
Justification. My sensory tool. Yeah.
Love it. I really thought you were going to talk about chewing gum today, but I like what you brought to the table. That's brilliant.
But we will talk about some of the questions we had. So we had a couple of questions. You actually wanted to talk about some stuff from last week that you wanted to follow up on. We can talk about that. Otherwise, I've got a couple of questions here that came in. One was around different sensory, goes on to sort of regulation strategies, different sensory tools for the classroom for a young person starting school. There was another question here about bike riding.
Yep.
And that kind of tied into what you were mentioning about, the arousal level and regulation. But, we've also got your information that you wanted to touch on related to anxiety.
Yeah.
Do you want to start with
I can start with that. I guess so. You and I had a conversation in our last podcast episode, I guess, around a couple of things, supporting a young person essentially in the midst of having a really tough time, like bordering on a meltdown, and how we utilize co-regulation to support that young person to come out of that. And we were also chatting about the negative self-talk and really intense feelings, sometimes around self-loathing,
stuff.
that can come from, following impulsive or unexpected actions where we've just been heightened in the moment and responded, whatever that looks like, and then feeling really remorseful afterwards or filled with a bit of shame, and how we can help flip the narrative for them. And I think reflecting back on that and how we answered that question, I actually thought that there was scope to step back even further again in terms of the education piece for young people around understanding where some of those responses can come from and what anxiety means and what that can look like for each person, because I think that can be a really great way to frame a lot of those conversations, but also just helping that young person understand about their brain and how they're wired and how that may then impact on how they interact with the world around them and interact with others. So I thought, discussing some resources or ways that you could support those conversations, this could be a really great platform to do that.
Absolutely.
I think there are lots of great resources available to support young people in understanding, what anxiety can look like, what it means for them, and how they can connect with that deeper understanding. One that we have access to at OTFC is an awesome book called Hey Warrior by Karen Young, and that had been suggested by psychologists. We have it available because it's a really awesome tool to use in sessions to chat things through. And I think what I love the most about it is it really is getting quite specific about talking about the brain makeup that contributes to anxiety and teaching children about the amygdala, which is really crucial for anxiety management and processing of emotions, because that's the part of the brain that helps to understand what's happening around us, identify potential triggers, and then what might then stimulate the release of those stress hormones, and essentially what might trigger a heightened state or that fight-flight response. So it's, I think there's this really lovely quote from there. It's saying that the amygdala is like a fierce warrior. It's there to protect you, but sometimes it works a little too hard. So it's just that understanding of, well, that's a really important part of our makeup and it serves a purpose and it's really important to help keep us safe. Yep. But actually sometimes how we interpret what's happening around us or understand what's going on can mean that our amygdala is perhaps worried a little bit too much. And I think when we actually have that understanding about what contributes to that, we can talk about it probably in a similar way that we were talking about last week, that you can separate out that young person from the behavior, because you're essentially saying that that's the response that's happening in your brain, that's where that's come from. But what are some strategies we can put in place to help settle that? So I think there's really great scope and things available to chat that through.
It reminds me also of another resource, and I think you mentioned it before, maybe with the guard dog and the wise owl.
Yeah, that's another one of my favourites. Yeah,
and those videos, I'm pretty sure you can easily
access
them online.
Yeah, we can link that in.
We can definitely link it in the show notes for that exact reason. When you're trying to teach a young person about something that is quite complex, such as anxiety, about how their brain works, there's no point going through a neuroscience course and trying to show them the pictures of the brain and explain it in a very foreign way.
Yeah.
We know through our therapy that you have to do it through play. You have to do it through a method that works. Even, for example, the amount of people that understand anxiety just from watching movies like Inside Out.
Yeah.
Inside Out 1, Inside Out 2, and that ability to label emotions and feelings and identify those through colours and a much more visceral way of experiencing that. Far, far easier than trying to do it through just words.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And Hey Warrior is a great example of that. The barking dog and the wise owl, also really good examples of, trying to put a character to a concept to make it consolidated in someone's mind.
Yeah. And I love, I think our sessions can be a really great way to workshop that, because it supports that. Well, essentially, it's psychoeducation, which, there's excellent evidence to suggest why that can be really important for supporting young people. But if you can, you're able to talk through some of these things. And yes, the guard dog on the wise owl's one of my favourite, because it's saying something very similar in that, we all have that that guard dog that will pipe up, help keep us safe if it perceives something happening around us that makes us feel unsure. And the wise owl is what helps us to problem solve and better understand and unpack what's going on. But sometimes when the guard dog voice is a little bit loud, it's really hard for us to hear what the wise owl needs to say. But then when you're doing things that perhaps feel a little bit trickier in sessions, and that might then bring up some of those feelings, you can support that young person in labeling that to go, hey, I feel like, if you're hearing any of that negative self-talk, I can't do this, I'm feeling unsure, to go, hey, I can hear that your guard dog's really active at the moment. What can we do to help bring our wise owl voice into this? And I think actually sometimes I've been able to use it and it's really it's disarming. So, you go, hey, hang on a second, that sounds like your guard dog. And then they'll have a little bit of a giggle, and that can almost soften it a little bit too, to then be able to put some strategies in place from there and give it another go, which is really cool.
And I guess you're using those cognitive behavioral techniques then to reframe someone's thought processes in that moment. To go, actually, it sounds like this is happening.
Yeah.
You might perceive it's this, but let's work on this together and reframe those thoughts. I guess in a therapy session, then how are you incorporating something like, hey warrior or guard dog and wise owl? How would you incorporate that in an actual therapy session? What would that look like?
Yeah, I think sometimes when I have introduced it, because I feel like you need to have a bit of a baseline rapport to then dive into this. So I think that's really important, because going into it in your first session when they're still building that trust with you, not all young people are going to respond to that. So how you introduce it is probably very dependent on that young person. But I guess because most of the clients I work with now are kind of that like 9 to 12 years. So as we're talking about stuff, I might say, hey, I've got something I'd love to show you. It really helped me. I wonder how that might feel for you. And then we almost use part of our session after we've regulated and moved to sit down and go through a book or something like that together. And I always find when I do introduce it, I use myself as the initial reference point to go, hey, this is what it looks like for me. Because then I think that's modeling about what those feelings can look like, and it helps them feel safe to share what it might mean for them, rather than having it solely about, well, this is for you. It kind of becomes, but this is for everyone. This is helpful for everyone to know about. I know we've sort of spoken about this before, because I think a lot of these books and references are really great, but there's a need for that understanding and unpacking that as we move all the way through the lifespan. What do you like to use with your teenage clients, or do you use a version of this and adapt it?
Yeah, I think it is what medium works best, and sometimes I will find it's the most effective thing is to go and look through some things with that person. Great to have an idea of what you're going to share, as in the information you're going to share, but if you've got resources that to do that with that person and actually guide them towards that, I'm hearing this resource helps explain a little bit more about that. We have game, like, I'm sure you've seen it, you've used it here at different sites as well. We have board games about cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT approaches, and using those sort of games to change how we're thinking, and helping to understand that what that anxiety and what's going on more. I think by the time a lot of the older clients come through to see us, they have an understanding of it, and it's about trying to refine it further, and sometimes it's really good to just either reinforce what they already know, which can be, absolutely, correct or valid information, or to maybe catch some misconceptions.
Yes.
And just to reframe that and together go, look, that sounds like this, and if that's what you think, I get it, but have you thought about it in this way? And again, it's using some of those same principles. But
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think like anything, as long as you're doing that with the young person, the family, and it's a collaborative approach, then the messages are going to be the same.
Yeah. I always encourage when I do introduce it, I'll talk it through with the parents as well, so there's similar language that we can use around it. But then I'll say to them, you have a think about what that looks like for you, so that you can put words to that, and then we can all be using that language together. And I think it can really be, it's such a powerful thing when you've got the tools to be able to chat through things like that. I had a young friend recently she was talking about getting overwhelmed at school, and she ended up just legging it to the bathroom. Well, actually, I think she had politely excused herself, but then she just couldn't come out afterwards. And we were chatting that all through. And I kind of said to her, because we've been having lots of conversations around what anxiety looks like for her and that fight flight response. And I said to her, I'm like, you do realize that that's, in that moment, that is that activated nervous system response. That's your fight flight. That's flight there. You're hiding. You want to get away from it. And she, for all of that awareness that she's building, just had such an aha moment looking at me going, oh my gosh, like, of course that's what that is. And I think if you can build that over time, and, we're obviously talking about adolescents and teenagers because that's where we often work, but there's such great stuff. The Hey Worry book, I feel like for much younger than that is really appropriate. And there's even bought a book for my little nephew who's 2 around emotions and feelings recently, because you can just start introducing those concepts really early. And I think the more we can talk about it, the more we can label it, the more we can talk out loud how we're feeling, it makes it safe for them to do that too.
And I might get onto it in another episode, but it kind of leads on to things like zones of regulation as well. But might touch on that another time.
Sounds good.
We have some more questions, a couple more that I wanted to get through. The next one was about activities for sensory regulation strategies or tools to be used within the classroom space for someone that's starting school. So we had a question come through regarding that. I didn't know if you had anyone straight away that when you're thinking of a classroom space, you often suggest or refer or make sure that maybe a school might have in place.
And what's funny? I feel like whenever we get questions like this, I'm like, yep, absolutely. We can go through what are some things you can use in the classroom that are really effective. But for me, I'd be looking at that and going, but that's one piece of the picture. And so I think for me, supporting those bigger movement opportunities potentially outside of the classroom is going to be a really awesome place to start. And whether it just very much depends on the needs of your young person, and some don't need as much as this, some need as much as you can provide. It can start with parents taking their kids to the playground before school, so they can get some big movement input. Or maybe it's, walking or riding to school.
But that's it, isn't it? So you're exactly right. When I looked at the question, I had a list of, potential classroom activities or class suggestions, things for the class that are useful. But at the same time, my first thought was, okay, I can suggest these things, but at the same time, it's very individual.
Yeah.
Like that might work for one child, but not for another.
Yeah.
So, and we've had episodes before where we've talked about strategies or regulation tools for a classroom, and you can go back through our catalogue. I think there was one we talked about the pros and cons of particular things.
Yeah, that's right.
And
yeah.
I even think we had very, very early in one of our first episodes, we had Zoe Mayu talking about sensory tools and sensory activities and whether they're good or not, myths and that sort of stuff.
Awesome.
And certainly one to listen through if you wanted to hear a bit more from her. But it can be so specific, but I often still see situations where it's okay, we'll just give them a gym ball. And I think, some of them work. I actually recommended a wobble stool for a client the other week because they completed the easy assessment. They had excellent core strength and their postural stability was fantastic. And there was someone who moves a lot and needs a lot of movement in their day and is physically active but does struggle with their attention, but can 100% sit on a wobble stool and it not impact their attention.
Yes.
It provides them the vestibular input they're looking for without drawing away from the attention. It's actually providing that effective state of arousal.
Yeah.
But that's not, I would say it's probably an exception rather than the
agree.
rule.
Yeah, I agree.
So some of those things can be quite useful. But I think you hit it nail on the head before when you mentioned, well, why don't we, from the start of the day, what we can do?
Yeah.
So rather than specifically going, what in the classroom can we have? That's part of it.
Yeah.
That's kind of like, I talk about things like small sensory tools and the big overhaul activities. And then when I put it all together and go, oh, that sounds a bit like a sensory diet.
Yes, exactly.
And that's pretty much what this is best answered with is if you're looking for, a person that's starting school and you do know they need increased movement opportunities or you do think that they need some regulation tools in the classroom, put together a sensory toolkit, put together a bunch of regulation activities they can do before school, after school, during school, big movement breaks.
Yeah.
And then essentially you've got the makings of a bit of a sensory diet, and that's probably going to be more effective than if they have a wobble stool or a fidget toy or something.
Yeah. And when we're talking about diets, we're obviously not necessarily, I was going to say not referencing food, but sometimes we do use things like we were, crunchy snacks and things like that anyway. But what we're essentially saying is just like you need to get a range of different foods in your diet to meet your needs and have adequate nutrition. You know, young bodies need a lot of different movement input to meet their sensory needs, and probably not too dissimilar to meals across the day. It's, you know, if you're aiming for 3 kind of bigger movement overhaul movements like you mentioned, with then snacks and top-ups in between with more of these smaller movement items, that can be really effective. But you're right, it has to be so individual. For some, they don't need 3 massive movement breaks a day to meet their needs. They might be more just doses across the day that just let them have a bit of a brain break, have a bit of a wriggle, and they can sit back and do what they need to. Some might be more than that. Some that might not be enough. And so it's just working out. I think that's probably a good place to start thinking about, well, how could I do 3 bigger movement opportunities across the day? And you can either scale up, scale down from there and see how that looks.
Yeah.
I think there are some things built into the school day, you know, like PE classes and time outside and recess and lunch. I think we have to remember too sometimes that the lunch breaks at school can be, you know, present their own challenges, make things a little bit tricky with grey areas in play and interaction. So that might provide the movement but not be as regulating as we necessarily intend it to be. So being really purposeful about what we're doing at those other points in time might just help them attend a little bit better in the classroom.
Yeah, very much so.
But what did we have? You've got a little list there, and I think there's some really good ones there.
Look, some ones that I often do, you know, suggest. And when I'm looking at the list of things, these are all pretty much, I guess, proprioceptive or items that will provide deep pressure.
Yes.
Because we know that that's generally going to be the most regulating regardless. So things
there's
like
a
weighted
reason
items.
that we reference it kind of every episode. It's just such a key grounding effect on the nervous system, and it links in with that part of the brain that helps to settle and calm. So there's some really good stuff that we can do with that to to support that regulation piece.
Things like TheraBands around the chair legs.
That's actually one of my favourites.
It is my favourite, I think, because it's so easy to use, and I'm a real fidgety person generally, so I always have. At the moment I'm fidgeting with my pencil, but just even around with my legs, having that TheraBand in the chair, around the chair, just provides input. It's quite useful. Yeah. And that, like I said, the proprioceptive input. So weighted items, lap pads, stuffed animals. You talked last week about your young friend with his giant Labrador. I'm not suggesting bringing a giant Labrador IKEA toy into the school, but weighted items like that can be really useful.
But I even think I often suggest to families, well, why don't you put the school bag on the lap on the way into school? It's these little opportunities to get that input as much as we can.
Yeah, and then there are some fidget tools or fidget toys that can be quite useful. I mean, you could throw a tassel in there if that's if you're inclined that way. And I remember for a young lad I worked with for a little while, suggested almost like a sensory toolbox for him in the classroom. So he needs a lot of big movement, and we know that, and so we provided activities to stimulate and to regulate through some big movement. But the little stuff like really big oral seeking, really big with smells and olfactory supports, and just having a little sensory toolkit that you can just almost cycle through. That's cool. Can be really useful. And you go, well, I've got these things in there, and you might take some other things out and keep them aside. And then next week you go, okay, they're not as interested in those things. Well, let's put in some new stuff. And you're cycling through it, and you rotate it, and then like a toy at home with a child or something, you bring it back after a few months and go, oh yeah, I forgot about that thing. And I really like it. So that in itself can be quite useful as well. And I think for teachers, what they're asking for at times is, I don't have the capacity to get someone having a lot of big movement all the time. Yeah. And so I just need something to help in the moment in this space itself. And that's where I think things like, weighted items, the right sensory tools, whether it's a fidget tool for the hands or smells or, something for the mouth can be quite useful. Yeah.
And even having like a little space set up in the corner of the classroom, like you might have seen them in there with really good reason, a little tent with lots of pillows and squishy items set up that anyone can access at any point if you just need to take a bit of a break from what's going on in the classroom. But the idea in having this kind of small enclosed space with lots of pillows and blankets, things like that, is once again tapping into that proprioceptive sense. And for a little person that does need a bit of movement, Could you have a mini trampoline there or
Mm-hmm.
a gym ball that you can roll over and crash into the pillows with support? It's just the chance to take a little break, as long as it's not too impactful for others in the class. But maybe even strategically using that in break times to get that movement in a controlled space.
Yeah. Regulation is important. And the next one was a question around, and our last question about bike riding.
Yeah.
And there were some comments here, so that some thoughts that came up that I came up with based on the question. So the question was about a young person who's bike riding, but finds the parent finds that they seem to become overhyped or dysregulated when they do go bike riding. And
in particular, did they
up the hill? I think it was,
in particular? Yeah.
So yes. Anyway, it raised a few questions for me.
Yeah.
Because
This is such a good one. I was like, this
biker,
is
can you ride a bike?
I can ride a bike.
Okay.
I like riding a bike.
Bike riding is a hard skill to learn.
Yes, it is.
So first and foremost, when I look at something like bike riding or any complex motor planning task, let's break it down. Let's see what's required here. Because anytime I see whether it's dysregulation, this person talked about, being silly or, getting overwhelmed, dysregulated or overhyped, then I'm wondering, is it a dysregulation or is it a sensory-based challenge that they're experiencing? Both. Are there social demands in play? So it raised a lot of questions for me.
Yeah.
And I will first start with what's required for a bike. So when you're so all the skills required for a bike, I could spend all day and list them probably, but if I'm thinking of,
And this is us talking about like when we reference these sensory motor foundations that help us do what we need. I feel like bike riding is an awesome way to explain why we talk about these things.
it is, and it's an example I use a lot actually. I think don't use as much, and I don't know why, but when I'm trying to explain how hard a task is or how hard integrating your sensory systems can be, I go to think of bike riding.
Yeah.
You need your balance. You need planning. You need the ability to use enough force to go up a hill, for example.
Yes.
You need
Or to place pressure
visual-
through your feet
Yep.
to like be able to cycle and move the pedals.
Yeah, exactly. So and that's just a few things, like the auditory processing of being able to hear things around you, your spatial awareness. It's
Your core control.
Yep.
Yeah. Your visual processing to understand what's going on around you, but then also for that to inform how you're moving through space.
So I think firstly you have to really don't underestimate how hard bike riding is, and kids that can ride a bike and learn how to ride a bike are doing a pretty good job.
Yeah.
Right. And
It's that classic thing, isn't it, of when we're learning to ride a bike. That's the epitome of a motor plan, saying that we're trying to bring all of these skills together. We're trying to get feedback in how we're moving to then inform how we, how we adjust our movements. Are we seeing refinement in the movement and seeing that shift from a motor plan to a skill in which it's automatic, it's more fluid, it takes less conscious effort. But in those initial stages, there can be so much brain power that goes into combining all of these skills together and trying to have this effective outcome.
Yeah.
To go from point A to point B on a bike.
And I think when you are, say when you're doing it solo in a controlled environment, when you've got other people around or other things around or other factors, that intensifies the expectations as well. But the question about this young person's becoming dysregulated or overhyped when they're riding, and I think it was, as you said, riding uphill.
One possible explanation
Would be that it is quite a challenging task for this person. And potentially riding on a flat surface has been a lot easier, but as soon as they're going uphill, there's a change in the environment, a change in the demands, and therefore a change in what the body has to do.
Yep.
And as OTs, we talk about that a lot. We go, well, that's the adaptive response. The change in the task or the environment requires the body to adapt, and that adaptive response is, the hallmark of our sensory integration theory and practice. And so for this person, they have not been able to effectively adapt their response to meet the demands of what's going on. Their adaptive response is to be silly or to become more overhyped or dysregulated.
Yeah. And how many times do we see that, if we're doing a session or we're conducting an assessment and you start to see like those little sneaky things that could very easily be, I think, misinterpreted, I suppose, where it's, a little bit more silly, making funny voices or looking like they're distracted, and then you're looking at them going, I think this is hard
it's
for
gonna be
you,
tricky.
and you're trying to avoid, trying to distract me from that. That's okay. I can help you work through that. But I think that's a really natural place where lots of people would go, oh, but you're not listening. You're not doing what I'm asking you. Can you please just focus on what I'm requesting? But the underlying thing of, but it's actually coming about because it's hard, can be really, an easy thing to miss, I think.
And so exactly that's one hypothesis, one interpretation. And I guess not knowing what it looks like for the child. For some, it could be that they get excited going up the hill. It could be just the adrenaline of bike riding. And I think about, I was riding with my son on the weekend and he was going really fast on the flat surfaces and I was having to like run after him because his confidence was there. It's like he's getting much more confident with it. And the adrenaline of going that speed and like, this is great. This is exciting. This is really exciting. can lead to an element of, dysregulation or increased arousal. Because from a different perspective, because he's mastered that skill and he's actually pushing the boundaries to try and extend himself there. And that does look different to clumsy, silly behavior. I could fall, or I'm getting a bit, I'm laughing about it because it's getting a bit hard, or I'm fatiguing.
Yeah.
No, we didn't even talk about, to be honest, the amount of endurance and effort it takes to do that, but fatiguing. And so, I guess they're two different potential hypotheses based on that presentation.
And I think even just thinking of that difference between riding on a flat surface where you're going straight, much easier to control, and then you think going up a hill, where all of a sudden if you don't apply the right force, you potentially might lose the momentum that you would have riding on a flat surface and you might start to go backwards, or it's harder to control the handles. They start to wobble a bit more. The movement becomes so much more unpredictable when it's already a tricky movement, actually just riding a bike in general. And I can see how that would be potentially anxiety provoking or increase those arousal levels. And then all of a sudden that regulation is starting to shift because perhaps what the feedback that they're getting in that moment is what's overstimulating as well, and processing all of those sensory aspects all together can then flood the brain and body too.
Anytime I think about any sort of task, so we've just broken down the task of bike riding and how it can change a different environment, I always draw back to that really core OT principle of the person, the environment, the occupation, the PEO model we talk about, where the person, for this young person, have a set of skills and they're able to do something, and the environment is the environment they're in doing something. That's another circle. And if you envisage this last circle at the bottom, these three concentric circles, the last one is the occupation, and the occupation here is bike riding. The person and the environment and the occupation working well together, for example, when they're on a flat surface, as soon as the environment changes, then that circle starts to move away, and then that overlap isn't quite as there, which means that there's a change in the environment that meant that the occupation has become harder, and that person's skills and all those circles are drifting away, which means you're not able to integrate or work those things together as well. And I think in that case, like and you always talk about it, like behaviors are just someone trying to express something's happening, like a change in what's going on. And this is a perfect example of that. If they were like this from the start, you go, okay, maybe bike riding is always hard. Or if it was, as soon as we change something, there's something that's changed that has made this person's behavior change, then you can start doing a bit of detective work and figuring out what it is.
Yeah. I was going to say, I guess, we've given lots of hypotheses here. How could this person potentially work out what might be the contributing factor? And I think, you're right. What does the level of control look like when the environment shifts riding on that flat surface? What does that level of control look like? And if you're watching them going up the hill, is it something that they're, thinking about your son with that adrenaline rush, that's going to be someone that looks like they're in control, I suppose, a little bit more. Whereas someone that's perhaps working really hard, do they look unsteady? Are they wobbling a little bit more? Does that look like that's kind of heightening them? I think those really key observations about, well, what does the movement look like, not just how they're presenting from a behavior side of things. And
even socially, like I think of the social demands, like if you're working so hard to just stay balanced on the bike and focus and ride, then you can't have a conversation with someone around you. You can't look left and right. You just focus so much in front of you of what's in front of you to keep yourself upright. And so you might go, oh, it looks like they're okay because they're focused on riding. But if you change the demand in any way, you go, actually, they're working so hard to keep themselves on there. So,
and what if you're riding as a family and the rest of the family are going up ahead, but you're really struggling with that, and then you add in those elements? Oh my gosh, there are so many things that happen for bike riding.
We are creating so many scenarios.
Yeah, that could be really dysregulating too. And if people are, you know, maybe if those behaviors start to come out and people are trying to encourage you or trying to get you to focus, or there's that framing about trying to discourage the silliness that they're seeing so they can bring their attention back to what they're doing. I just feel like there could be so many things happening in that moment that's, making it hard. So can you isolate each of those elements and see if you can notice any shifts?
Absolutely.
And if it is that we're bridging those skills to then support them in doing that, then perhaps it is, you know, working back to go, like, there's a really big hill coming up. Let's save our energy for the next one. I'm going to get off my bike. We can walk up together, you know, making that feel really safe, and then grade it down. Start with something that feels a little bit more achievable, build up those skills across a smaller hill, and then see if you can work your way up.
Yeah,
literally.
Exactly. Yes, very good advice, Eleanor. That's it. All our questions done.
Yeah, good questions.
Thank you for following up from last week. That was good. I think there were certainly some things that would have been worth just providing a bit more info on. And yeah, Hey Warrior, great book. Guard Dog Wise Owl, also a great resource.
Awesome
we'll
resource.
link them in our show notes.
If you also want to send us any questions for our upcoming podcasts, you can do so via Instagram, OTFC Group, or you can send them through to our email address, podcast@otfcgroup.au.
Absolutely correct. Thank you.
We hope to hear from you soon.
Yes, we do. And for our young friend Fletch, who I think still listens to us to get to sleep at night, hope you're still doing that. And anybody else around the world that's listening,
shout out for your dad too.
my dad.
Yep.
Yeah, hope they're having a good time overseas.
Number one listener.
Number one ticket holder. Thank you, as always. And for the rest of you, we will speak to you soon. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.